Welcome back. In this video, we'll be outlining briefly a hypothetical persuasive essay to demonstrate how we would begin the pre-writing process for an essay like this, how we would collect and generate evidence, and then how we would organize that evidence into a compelling persuasive essay. To review briefly before we begin, recall that persuasive and argumentative essays have three major components, these being claim, evidence / warrant, and rebuttal or counter argument. For the purposes of this outline that we will be creating, we are going to include, of course, claim. We will be looking for at least two pieces of supporting evidence that we can use in defense of our chosen stance. And we will also be trying to incorporate a rebuttal. The rebuttal, of course, is not necessary, strictly speaking, but it does do a lot in terms of promoting the effectiveness of an argument. So whenever a rebuttal can be provided, especially with a strong response to the rebuttal, the argument benefits as a result. So in order to work on this hypothetical essay, we will use a sample prompt. And for the purposes of this video, we will be using the prompt which asks us to decide whether or not controversial books should be banned. So I'm going to go ahead and write that up here. Prompt: should books be banned? So typically persuasive / argumentative essays will ask you to choose an affirmative or negative stance on a particular topic. In this case, we have to decide if books should be banned, and if so, why, or we need to decide if books should not be banned, and if not, why. So in both cases, we need to have our firm claim. We cannot be ambiguous. So if, when writing an argumentative essay, you tend to be ambivalent, you waffle between the two sides, or you provide a comprehensive discussion of both sides without really advocating for one over the other, that becomes an expository essay and not a persuasive or argumentative essay. So very critical that when you're writing an essay of this nature, you are very, very, very clear and firm in your stance, and you are not ambivalent about it. Now, we never want to start with our claim. We always want to approach our argumentative persuasive topics in good faith and with a clear sense of rationality. This means that we want to review the evidence that is provided first before we come up with a claim. So we always want to review evidence and then decide our claim based on that, not do the opposite, which would be to force fit the evidence to fit whatever preconceived claim we have in mind. Because again, the claim might be based on illogical or ill-founded reasoning. And so we're not doing ourselves any favor when we selectively look for evidence to support a position or stance that's already kind of spoiled or rotten. So what we want to do here is to develop evidence for why books should be banned and why they shouldn't be banned. And then after we review the evidence that we've generated, we'll decide from there what stance we want to choose. So we can decide based on the abundance of evidence for one given side or another, or we can decide the one that we simply enjoy more. So to create this evidence, we will use a T-chart. And we'll have here why books should be banned. And we will have on this side the evidence for should be not. So let's consider reasons why books should or should not be banned. One of the obvious reasons why books may be banned, or why some may advocate that, is the propagation of dangerous ideas. So an example of this might be a book that glorifies or romanticizes substance abuse, self-harm, etc., And then let's say a vulnerable population such as teenagers or teenagers with mental health issues begin reading this book. The book then influences the teenagers in a negative direction, right? That actually harms their health rather than helps it. So that would be an example of a quote unquote dangerous idea that's propagated by literature. A reason why books should not be banned would be freedom of expression in art. And this essentially means that artists should be free to express themselves. And that if we ban those artists or ban their literature, then we are essentially censoring and choosing what is allowed to be said and what is not allowed to be said. And this, of course, has a detrimental effect on art and innovation in the artistic realm. So the more freedom that artists have, the more innovation there can be. And there's also greater room for social critique. So we would want our art to be particularly critical or capable of interrogating certain norms or policies, politically, socially, religious, etc. We want art to not only be a source of entertainment, but also a source of kind of communal and social self-reflection, and allows us to correct negative tendencies or antisocial tendencies that maybe are harmful to us on the whole. So to save time, let's consider that these are the pieces of evidence that we've come up with. We have on the one hand, the propagation of dangerous ideas being the main driving force as to why books should be banned. The counter arguments to this would be that we want to advocate for freedom of expression / art, and we also want to maintain the role of art as a form of social critique. If art is censored, that tends to lead art to being censored, not necessarily because of a genuine good faith reason, but because people in power don't appreciate what is being said about them or what is being said about their policies. So we open the door to censorship being abused for the purposes of retaining power and controlling information, not so much protecting people in good faith. So if I were looking at these two sides of evidence, I would consider that for my negative stance, that books should not be banned, I have two pieces of supporting evidence, and that for my positive, my affirmative stance, I have one piece. I would then consider that I have a more greater quantity of evidence with the negative stance. And so I would decide from there that probably the negative stance is the one that I want to proceed with for the argumentative essay. These would be my two major points of evidence. And then my rebuttal would be this alternative idea, which I would want to address in the heart of the essay. So now that we have our evidence, we're going to proceed to creating our outline. Okay, and so again, very important that we begin with this T-chart or something like it first, so that we can advocate for reviewing evidence prior to coming up with the claim. We always want to leave the claim late in the process so that we make sure that we have an abundance of evidence in support of it. All right, let's do a quick outline. Excuse me, I'm gonna have to leave the red dot there. So we always start with our IBC structure. In the case of our introduction, we will provide background information, on the banning of books. A way to do this would be to discuss how banning of books has been a controversial practice throughout history. You could also use research that you have done about the banning of books and perhaps look at statistics that can give some context for this topic. And then we would want to move into our thesis statement. So again, we want to be clear and firm with our thesis statement. In this case, it would be something like books should not be banned. Because, so I want to emphasize this, we will always want to introduce our evidence within our thesis statement. Books should not be banned because they allow for artistic expression and social critique. Even though they can also propagate controversial ideas. All right, so even though this thesis statement is somewhat lengthy, you'll notice that I have embedded both of my supporting pieces of evidence. We have the first one here. We have the second one here. And I've also embedded my rebuttal. So I've included my two pieces of evidence, and I've also included my rebuttal. So the rebuttal being included is not, again, necessary. My thesis statement, in fact, could just be that books should not be banned. But because I want to strive for specificity and clarity in my writing, I want to ensure that when I introduce my essay and in that introduction, that I provide all the building blocks and all the expected landmarks, so to speak, that the reader can expect to find within the essay. So if the reader reads the thesis statement, understands the stance, and then understands the evidence and the counter argument to be explored within the essay, he or she is not surprised while reading. And so it's about maintaining this, again, experience of easygoing, calm comprehension throughout the essay. I don't want the reader to be confused or alarmed at anything that comes up within the essay. I say confused and alarmed in a very loose sense. Essentially, we are trying to mitigate confusion. We want to make sure that everything is expected and that there are no real curveballs. Just as an aside, when you are working on your introduction, you want to make sure that you do not include anything that will not be explored, and vice versa. You don't want to include anything in the body that was not alluded to or previewed by the introduction. So the introduction is very important. You always need to be previewing what is going to be in the body of your essay. All right, so we have our thesis statement and our general background information established in the introduction. We now want to use our body paragraphs to decide what evidence we want to use to exemplify our points. So we always want to be using evidence. The more specific evidence we can use, the better. This will allow us to make better cases for our argument. So we have typically at least 3 body paragraphs, and there will be a body paragraph for each of our pieces of evidence. So we start with supporting 1, this being artistic expression. We want to make sure that we include some kind of evidence for this. And so we can use historical evidence, current events, literature, etc., to support this. So we want to think about something that promotes the use of our or validity or value of artistic expression in our society. Remember that our supporting 2 is social critique. Similar to this, we want to provide evidence to support why social critique is important within a society. We would be wanting to look for pieces of literature that have served the purposes of social criticism and social justice, perhaps. One that comes to mind almost immediately would be George Orwell's 1984. And the purpose of 1984 is largely to explore some of the, well, in Orwell's sense, all of the kind of negative tendencies or traits of dystopian authoritarianism. So that would be the function of that novel. And so without that novel, we would not have a very valuable way or literary criticism of that mode of government. After we discuss these two pieces of evidence, we would then move into the rebuttal, which would be the propagation of negative ideas or controversial ideas. Now, it's very important that not only do we provide evidence for this point, we also want to provide a response to this. And so what do we mean by a response? So in essence, if we introduce this counter argument and we suggest that not banning books allows for the possible spread of ideas that are antisocial or harmful in some way, then we need to have a response to that. We need to counter that rebuttal, because if we leave that rebuttal unaddressed, it will harm our essay in the long run. So how do we address the fact that there may be a propagation of negative ideas? So one way to argue against this would be to suggest that by allowing negative ideas to actually spread, you open them up to dispute. So rather than allowing them to fester perhaps in isolated echo chambers online or in private in your community, by allowing ideas to be exposed, they can enter into a kind of communal discourse wherein others have the opportunity of arguing against them. So this qualifies the danger of potentially controversial ideas being spread around, and it doesn't compromise the supporting evidence you have already established in the rest of the body. Also notice that the order in which we address these pieces of evidence and rebuttals is the same order in which we discuss them in the introduction in our thesis statement. So whatever order you use in your introduction to introduce your topics and subtopics, you must follow that same order when you're writing your essay within the body. And again, this is to ensure that the reader is not confused and has a very easy, lax experience reading your essay. You want your essay to be as easy as possible to understand and follow along. The more difficult it is, the higher it is, the likelihood rather, that you will not be successful in communicating what you want to communicate. Okay, finally, we have established our introduction and our body. We will now be working on the conclusion. And again, our conclusion is relatively simple. It is a matter of establishing the so what. So we generally want to restate our thesis. In this case, that books should not be banned for the various reasons that we've already discussed. And we also want to explore the so what question. And this is a fairly easy one to answer in this case. We would want to reinforce and reemphasize the importance of books as a social critiquing tool, that books can be used to combat negative ideas, that they can be used to educate, that they can be used to allow for artistic innovation, which allows people to explore different facets of the human condition, what it means to live in a particular society, and so on and so forth. And so collectively, socially, we tend to benefit from great art rather than suffer from it. And so conclusion would really want to reinforce those major points so that the reader reads this and then understands this is why books should not be banned. All right. In closing, I hope that this video provided some clarity as far as how to start pre-writing and outlining for a persuasive / argumentative essay. This was not a exhaustive example by any means, just kind of basic rudimentary example to demonstrate how one would start by generating evidence. This is positive and negative evidence, depending on whatever the topic is. Establishing a claim. We always want to establish our claim after we have developed or generated our evidence. And then from there, once we have established the claim, we can create and outline our thesis statement and body paragraphs. Outline, body, and conclusion. So the order would be to generate evidence based on whatever the topic is, review the evidence and search for either the evidence that we have an abundance of or the evidence that we find most comfortable to write about. We then establish our claim based on that assessment. We create our thesis statement, we provide background information in our introduction, and then we outline our body paragraphs in which we explore our supporting evidence and or rebuttals, and we provide not only examples, but also explanations and responses in the case of a counter argument particularly. And finally, in our conclusion, we reinforce and restate the major takeaway from the persuasive essay. We re-emphasize and reinforce the reason why we chose the stance that we chose at the beginning of the paper. With that said, again, I hope that this provides some help and clarity when it comes to writing a persuasive essay. Thanks for your time. I'll see you in future videos.